Welcome to Deal Dialogue.
Hello and welcome to Deal Dialogue, a discussion on all things M&A and financing. I'm Rob Hickey with RBC Mid-Market M&A. In this segment, we'll discuss people. Some companies, no matter whether they make consumer products or deliver services, will say that people are their most valuable asset. Today, we'll discuss how people considerations can shape the planning and execution of a transaction and how to position for post-transaction success. Joining us today, along with our production engineer, Tarek Chami, is Jeff Tone with Mid-Market M&A and our very special guest, Amy Childs from RBC's National Client Group. Jeff and Amy, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Both of you bring unique experience to the topic of people or human resources in a transaction. So before we explore all of the people considerations, let's learn a little bit more about the people we have here today. Why don't you tell us about your backgrounds?
Perfect. So currently I'm in National Client Group's credit structuring team, but that's actually a recent change for me. I've spent the bulk of my career working in human resources, both at RBC as well as in consulting, and so have a broad range of experience, including compensation, talent management, org design, coaching leaders and people managers, pension and benefits, and the list goes on. I have had some M&A transaction experience with both big and small while at RBC, as well as in consulting, leading and advising on HR components of the deal.
Awesome.
Great. Currently, I'm a director here in the M&A group at RBC. Prior to joining RBC a year ago, I was with a PE-backed company where we purchased and integrated 16 various sized companies. Certainly, I can say from firsthand experience that buying a company is challenging. However, the value of the acquisition can be significantly eroded if the softer human elements are lost in integration.
Well, as you can tell from the backgrounds of the folks here today, we're not going to be reading from a textbook. They've got some real-world experience with people, which is fantastic. Why are people so important in a transaction?
I think, Rob, just to start off, I think that, and again, my experience in all of our transactions, the focus during the transaction, but more importantly after the transaction closed, was really around retention. We set aggressive targets, and we did everything we could to possibly achieve those targets.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think buyers are increasingly recognizing that people aspects of running a business are fundamental to driving return on investment. And, I think we've all heard the studies of things can, really fall apart afterwards, and you see employee engagement drop off. And when you see that engagement drop off, you see productivity drop off as well. So it's really critical to understand the people component.
Given the risks and opportunities around that, what are some of the things business owners should be thinking about as they prepare to potentially sell their company, whether it's a financing or a sale, anything that's going to involve a significant step forward in the evolution of the company? What should they be prepared to speak to and share documents on?
Definitely. So I think as a business owner is preparing for that sale process and thinking about what are potential buyers going to want to know. And, if I were to narrow it down to sort of 5 buckets, I think org structure and having that employee roster in place, understanding or being prepared to discuss critical talent and leadership capability, being able to speak to employment agreements that are in place, compensation and benefits programs, and then just a big bucket here, but workplace policies and other HR policies. And really, if I dive into each of those quickly, org structure and employee roster. As potential buyers look at the company, they're going to want to understand how many employees are there, what roles exist, how are these people paid, what are all the different benefits, so that they can get a sense of what the cost base is. When it comes to critical talent and leadership capability, who are these individuals? What roles are they performing? Why are these individuals and roles critical? What's important to these people? Potential buyers will want to understand all of this and will want to make sure that not only do they keep these people, they keep these people happy after the close of the deal. So being ready to talk about these individuals and having the biographies ready, and potentially as you get further on in the process, buyers will want to meet with these people. The third piece, employment agreements, different companies will vary. Sometimes there'll be written contracts in place, but sometimes there's a lot of things that have been communicated verbally but not necessarily documented. So getting all of that prepared and being able to speak to it and any unique things that may be in place, whether it's compensation, perhaps change in control, severance, etc. Comp and benefits programs, again, pretty self-explanatory, but be prepared to speak to the details of that. And then the last bucket we mentioned, workplace policies. Is there an employee handbook? Are there certain policies? Are there key analyses that you think someone would want to know, whether it's turnover or health and safety infractions, and sort of step outside of your own mind and put yourself in the shoes of someone else and think about what are the hot spots that someone might zone in on and want to understand.
Jeff, in your experience as a buyer of businesses, when you looked at companies in financial services, obviously people an important part of that, how do you assess the amount of personal goodwill in a business and the importance of the owner's role in an ongoing company and the management underneath?
Yeah, for the most part, when we were looking at our acquisitions, we'd kind of put them into two buckets. So we would do the classic kind of tuck-in, and with those transactions, the owner, founder, there was a high degree of personal goodwill.
Right.
And the employees looked to that owner, and so we did everything we could to make sure that the owner was going to stay with the business. So in this case, what we would do is we'd extend or make it a condition that a fair chunk of the proceeds would have to be rolled over into the equity
Right.
of our company. That would go a long way to solving any retention issues with other employees. For the larger transactions, retention was still very important, but again, the business was larger, so we didn't have to incentivize management to stay with the company.
Jeff, you are the master of the setup here because you mentioned culture, which is obviously very important. So I'll ask right now, how do you assess culture, Jeff and Amy, and why is it important in this context?
Yeah, so $1 million question, and unfortunately it's not a perfect science when it comes to assessing culture, but definitely something that you want to be thoughtful about, and really thoughtful about in terms of what do you want the culture to look like once the deal closes. So there's a few different things that we could suggest you look at as you try to come to that determination of what is the culture. So as you're going through the process and as you're having conversations with management, looking at processes and ways of working. What processes exist? How are decisions made? Is it really all coming back to one individual, often owner, founder of the company, or is it more of a collective approach? Is there a focus on really getting things right or kind of going with the flow a little bit more and focusing on simplicity? Do you see, a real avoidance of risk, or does the company embrace learning? Looking at what their stated values are and just doing a rough comparison to what your company's stated values are to see what that alignment looks like. Understanding what behaviors are rewarded and incented. Behaviors of the leaders is another good thing to look at. Even, all the publicly available information on a company, whether it be their website, awards that they've won, touring facilities can also be, you can glean a lot of information from that. So as I said, it's really not a perfect science, but there's a bunch of different data points or artifacts that you can gather throughout the process to really get a better sense of what that culture looks and feels like and what it looks like relative to your company, what the gap may be, and then make an assessment of, well, how big of a gap is that and how might it mitigate that risk, and try to put incentives in place to get around it.
Yeah, I think also just to add, I think that the more time that can be spent during the transaction to gauge and to have dialogue with the senior people in the organization and to really test them around culture and what's going to be important to those employees after the deal closes, and just being willing to be flexible and open to suggestions, I think is quite key as well.
You're listening to Deal Dialogue.
We've talked about the documents that you would typically look at, the amount of preparation from an organizational perspective, and some of the culture issues. Now we get into a transaction. Who should be involved?
That's a great question. I think the rule of thumb, and Amy, I think you probably agree, probably less is more. It's a very onerous, time-consuming process, and there's no guarantee that it's actually going to happen. So just having the very senior people that can help throughout the entire diligence process, limiting it to just those people is probably the right thing to do. The more people in the tent, as we say, will increase the chance that there might be a breach in confidentiality. And the last thing you want is you don't want your employees wondering what it really means to them. So again, I think that the best rule of thumb is just to keep that group fairly selective.
Yeah, just to add to that, your employees or your clients, in a situation like this, it's not over until it's over. And so if information is leaking and you're not the one controlling that message, there may be, some consequences that were unintended.
Has it ever happened to either of you where it got out before word got out of the transaction? And what does a business owner do? What's the strategy to deal with that unfortunate eventuality?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just realism. I mean, it happens, and it's happened to me in past roles, and really it really comes down to ultimately the relationship that the seller has with his employees. And at that point in time, the best thing to do is just to fess up and tell them what's going on, but give them some idea what it looks like kind of post-close, and reassure them that really, for the most part, there isn't going to be wholesale change.
Okay. So obviously having done it before and having a strategy to deal with it in the event that it happens is helpful. You start the transaction, you meet management, they've never been through it before. How do you prepare them?
When from the onset of a mandate, and even before, we're very careful and sensitive to make sure that we prepare our clients that this is it's a long process, that sometimes it can be difficult, and of course, that 7 to 12 month period, there's going to be ebbs and flows in terms of their involvement. Certainly, we prepare them that they're going to be heavily involved in management presentations. They're going to be heavily involved during certain points of due diligence. But really, at the end of the day, we want them to focus still on just growing that business, continue to drive value, and really, you've hired an advisor to shoulder most of the burden.
At the top of the show, I talked a little bit about how people are, obviously the most important asset of the company. When you talk to business owners, whether they're considering a transaction or not, you ask them what some of their biggest challenges are, they'll tell you it's people. So someone does a transaction, obviously you want to ensure that those people are there after the fact. Talk a little bit about retention.
Yeah, I think in a buyer that really knows what they're doing should be super focused on that whole piece. And so whether they have something formal in place from past transactions, but I think the key word is just flexibility. So, there's equity that could be extended to people, to senior management. That's a great retention technique. It will allow the new investors, the new management team to grow. So, their interests are aligned. And then there's the more basic retention bonus that's contingent on a certain amount of time being spent in the business post-close, or it may even be, customers and those types of things.
Right.
Yeah, just to add to that piece, I wholeheartedly agree with everything you said, Jeff. I think in addition to the monetary retention are those non-monetary pieces. Those will really impact someone's engagement and whether they want to stay. So things like, the work that they were doing and keeping some consistency there, how decisions are made. Even, you work at a company and you have a great relationship with the management team, and all of a sudden it changes and you worry about, well, what's going to happen to my career and my development? So as that new management team comes in, taking the time to really wrap your arms around people and build that relationship and show that, there's still potential and they're still going to be invested in is really important. And sometimes it's just those changes in the little things that can set people off. So, a couple funny examples. If every month you celebrate people's birthdays through getting birthday cakes, keep doing that. Or if in the summer you let people out early on Friday afternoons, those are the things that are important to people that may seem minor, but can end up really impacting.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And I think another kind of real life example is when we would buy a company, HR would look very closely at the benefit plans that were in place for both. And where there was going to be an additional cost to the new employees, we made sure that we always built that into our model to make sure that there wasn't going to be an immediate cost to them. And again, it was just, we were being sensitive to the fact that we didn't want a lot of change. And again, I think it worked out well in the end for us.
So we've talked about getting people prepared. We've talked about trying to set the stage for retaining people. We're getting to the finish line. Now it's time to communicate to the employees. Talk a little bit about the strategy to do that.
Yeah, so I think we made this point earlier. You really want to be in control of the message at all times. So as you're getting closer to that signing, putting some thought into what that critical path looks like and what the communications look like. So some of the things that you want to think about is when and how will you announce to your teams? Ideally in person if possible, but if you do have folks in remote locations and want to do it all at once, is there video, WebEx, and things you can use? Preparing key messages. So you want to make sure that everyone's on the same page and singing from the same song sheet. Highlighting benefits. It's not just about this is what's happening, but what are some of the benefits of the deal that you can highlight both for the company but also for employees. When you're announcing, having both sides, the new buyer there as well, I think is really important. It shows the early commitment. And then the final piece is try to anticipate what questions, the tough ones as well, might come your way so that you're prepared for answers when they come.
Yeah, again, we always made sure, and we were sensitive to the impact that this type of news would have on people. So we made sure that someone senior from our company was there to welcome people, give them a little bit of information about what the future is kind of going to look like, but really just to reassure them that there wasn't going to be wholesale change.
There's a lot of detail that you've both been giving around how to make a deal successful and set it up to be that way. But statistically, a lot of things fail in the execution post-transaction and post-merger integration. How do you set up for success, and what do you do after the closing to make sure that all of the steps that you took to get to the finish line come together after closing?
Yeah, and I think that the short answer is just to have a well thought out, articulated plan that's on paper.
Right.
Certainly my experience, as I said earlier, kind of opening, it's easy to buy a company. You can hire the advisors and you can get a transaction closed, but it's far more difficult to actually, there's the real world element. And so, you have to put down aggressive targets. We had a 100-day plan, and the board expected that that business would be fully integrated, and there was checkpoints all the way along. So again, I think that if there's oversight and the right accountabilities are put in place, that you're going to set yourself up for success. Amy?
Yeah. I think I'd love everything that you said. 2 additional points I'd make is recognize that people don't like change and they don't like uncertainty. And so providing that ongoing communication that's fair, that's honest, that's consistent is really important. And then, as you said, on the planning piece, continue to go back to what are the strategic objectives of this deal and don't lose sight of that. Have good goals and milestones in place and continue to really hone in on those.
Amy, in the last 10 years, have there been any fundamental changes in how people want to have a dialogue with their employer and workplace culture? Has that changed?
I think that people continue to expect frequent, honest, open communication
Right.
with their employer. And I mean, we see that in the workplace. We see that in all realms with the advent of social media and things like that. So I think that that is one for sure. Other big trends within workforce, of course, flexibility is really important to people in terms of how they work and where they work. Another big thing is this culture of coaching and feedback, which I
Right.
think kind of links to the first piece in terms of that open, candid behavior. And that's multi-directional. That's not just from top down. That's from peer to peer, from those above, below, in different teams, because we know that feedback makes us better.
Jeff, in the last 15 years, can you give me one example of a people-related issue that just completely threatened to blow up a deal and how you got through it?
I would say I've got a whole bunch actually, but one actually came to mind, and I don't know if this story is relevant, but we had a family situation where one family member was buying out the other family member, and the deal terms were all ironed out. But the deal itself almost went away because our client, being the seller, wasn't going to get a desk, and he wasn't going to get his car serviced by the company going
Right,
forward.
right.
So it's crazy things like that you can't really plan for. But that's really, it's that people element to it all, and you had to manage that through the process, and fortunately we did. So.
Yeah, location in two different deals that I can think of has ended up, and this is in situations where people have, defined benefit pensions going from that to not having it, which is significant. Location, though, was the biggest item that came up on the people side, and I've seen that a couple times now.
Unbelievable. Well, look, this has been a fascinating discussion. In M&A, transactions, financing, we can do all the negotiating and calculations and valuations to come out with a perfect transaction. But if the most important aspect, as it often is in any deal that we do, is people, you don't get these things right, it's not going to work. So Amy and Jeff, this has been fascinating. The people aspects in context of a transaction are critical. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
That's it for this segment of Deal Dialogue. Our guests were Amy Childs and Jeff Tone. Our production engineer, as always, is Tarek Chami, and I'm Rob Hickey. Thank you for putting us in your ear or on your device. Until next time, have a great day, and good luck with your deals. Deal Dialogue is a production of RBC Mid-Market M&A.
Welcome to Deal